Hi guys, and welcome to episode 4 of the Ultimate Physique podcast. I'm your host Carl Reggio, and today I'm talking to world-renowned strength and conditioning coach Stephane Cazeault. Stephane has been involved in the fitness industry for close to 30 years, being the former head of education at Poliquin Group, as well as coaching numerous professional athletes across a variety of sports. As always, if you get any value from today's episode, it would mean the world to me if you leave me a comment, like this video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Now let's jump into today's episode. Steph, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We're very excited to have this conversation. So for anyone out there who hasn't heard of you or hasn't read any of your courses, books, any content that you put out there, could you give us a bit of an overview in terms of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so Stephane, I'm originally from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and I have a bachelor's degree in exercise science. I was a football player, a martial artist in my, all the way up to college, basically. And then after college, I did a bunch of continuing education. I graduated in 2000, so of course back then there was not a lot out there. I did some Charlie Francis, Ian King, Eric Serrano, John Berardi was just starting out.
Yeah.
Charles Poliquin. And Charles Poliquin, maybe it's the French-Canadian connection, but to me, he's the one where it really clicked for me. Like Charles' content, information at the time. I first read about him in 1995 in Muscle Media 2000.
Yeah.
And just the way he wrote training programs back then, I'd never seen it. He actually had rest periods. He had tempo prescriptions. Back then it was the 3-digit tempo. And I don't know, it just clicked. So whenever he started doing it education, I started doing it. So, and I really, really liked it. It clicked. And then in 2005, I moved to the United States and started working in a high performance facility in St. Louis, Missouri, where it was kind of cool because at the time it was one of the first in the country where it was one of those facilities where we had chiropractors, we had doctors, and we had IV, access to IV. We had the strength and conditioning part. So I was in the weight room. I became the head of strength and conditioning for that facility. So we were working with professional athletes and Gen Pop, but in conjunction with the medical chiropractic staff. So it was this kind of holistic practice, which was kind of cool. It allowed me to learn a lot more about, rehab modalities and stuff like that. So for example, let's say we train an NFL guy that had hip restriction and we had a lower body session.
Yep.
He would come in before his workout, would go upstairs, would get ART, let's say on the hips, would come downstairs. He would have momentarily would have more range of motion, so we could train at a deeper range and solidify if you want that newfound range of motion.
Yeah.
And then after the session, they would go back up. They would do, let's say, IV if there was a game coming up. They could do a acupuncture. So it was this kind of cool, all encompassing modalities for athletes. And there, I started with hockey, being Canadian, I guess. But my real love was football. I played American football. I was a running back. So my goal was to train NFL players.
Yep.
So after the hockey guy, it evolved to NFL. Then it evolved to Major League Baseball. And then what was cool is in 2010, 2011, and 2012, I was hired as a high performance consultant with the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team. And I was in charge of writing the programs, not only for the entire team, but also for the farm teams.
Yeah, wow.
So in spring training in February, we would go down to Florida, Jupiter near West Palm Beach. That's where the Cardinals have their facility. And I would assess, me and Alexandra was there as well. So we would assess 76 players, put them in different categories, send them the programs. And then on top of that, I had about 10 or 11 personal one-on-one players that would be training with me year round. So then it was truly more of an individualized approach. So I learned a lot. It was a cool experience dealing with the politics, if you want, of working with pro teams.
Yeah.
It's a good experience. Then in 2012, I was approached by Charles Poliquin to go work for him in Rhode Island. So I took the job, moved to Rhode Island. And then that's when, at that time, I was the head of strength and conditioning and education. Then there was the whole fight, if you want, with the ownership and Charles Poliquin. So Charles in 2013 kind of left, but I stayed there. Then the whole thing kind of became a little bit weird. So in 2016, January 2016, I decided to start my own thing, Kilo Strength Society. So we wanted to be a group training facility.
Yep.
So we moved to Cali. We're in Huntington Beach, which is 45 minutes south of Los Angeles. And we had the whole concept. We have the facility. We started the group training. But as we were building our clientele, I started having people asking me if I was going to do education. So I'm like, it was not even part of my plan.
Yeah.
But I'm like, well, why not? As we're waiting to build that clientele, why not? So we started doing education, and that really, really grew.
Yeah.
And then in 2020 with COVID, we actually, at one point, the gym was closed for like 6 months, basically. At one point, we're sick and tired of it. Me, Alexandra, and Kelsey took a 2-week trip to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of like took a step back and look at where we were business wise, because by 2021, our 5-year lease was done in California.
Yep.
So we're like, okay, it's either we renew and we keep on going, or we shift gears and put all of our focus on education. Because what happened in Cali is we were spending 80% of our time on the gym.
Yep.
But the vast majority of our income came from the education platform. So we're like, well, what if we focused more on the education and tried to grow that a little bit more? So we decided to move to South Florida, being closer to our clientele, education-wise, because most of our students come from East Coast US, East Coast Canada, or Europe.
Yep.
So it's just a little bit more access. And for us, like, I wanted the nice weather. So South Florida, it's hard because South Florida is the only continental US spot where you have a tropical climate.
Yeah.
Like it's like you're in the Caribbeans, basically. So it's like this year-round cool climate, like it's summer year-round. So really love it. So now we are focused just on education. And we have online courses, live courses, and on, and like we're loving it. We're still trying to grow and keep creating more and more useful content for students who are personal trainers, strength coaches, and fitness enthusiasts.
Yeah, wow. And I mean, just for anyone listening as well, I had the pleasure of coming over to your original gym in Huntington Beach, I think I'm going to say
Yeah.
like 2018, maybe.
Yeah, 2018. Yeah.
And that was like, it's an interesting thing for, I suppose, a lot of trainers, on our side of the world in Australia and New Zealand, because it's so inaccessible, going to Europe or going to America for in-person, seminars and workshops, which I think the fitness industry has really evolved in the sense now that a lot of the cool stuff that you would have experienced with Poliquin Group and educating in person, like doing all of that fun stuff where you had theory and then you applied it in the gym, it kind of doesn't exist, to that degree, I don't think anymore. And coming
No.
was, the shining example of how good that actually is.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, you're right, man. Like, unfortunately, it does not exist anymore. And I think that, to me, like, the way I'm assessing it, it's double-sided. You have one, COVID, that I think really, really changed the dynamics.
Yeah.
People don't travel as much anymore, simply because now with COVID, because everything was prohibited, people figured out that they could learn through online platforms.
Yeah.
That it was cheaper, more accessible, they didn't have to travel, blah, 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 blah. So now the expectation is, well, I don't need to travel anymore because I can have online education. And then, and I think that because of this, because that's the interesting part, right? I've been involved in education now for since 2012, basically when I started with Poliquin Group.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because like you could see through generation the change in trends. Like, I'm Gen X.
Yeah.
Gen X, we were like a certain type of students. Then you had the millennials. And then now you have the Gen Zs that are like a different type of student as well. Like they learn differently, they have different expectations.
Yeah.
And because them, they went through COVID in their college years, if you want. I think the way they learn is completely different. So now we have to cater our education to suit their needs, because us, we get older, but our client, we're always catering to the 25 to 35, no matter what. That's always the our
Yeah.
average target, right? So it's just about evolving. But I feel like now the big difference is when I started, courses were 5 days long.
Oh yeah.
You had like the practical, oh yeah, you had the practical, the theoretical component, and then we brought it down to 3 days. So now for 2025, we brought every course down to 2 days. Now
Wow.
it's going to be Saturday, Sunday. That's it. So
Yeah.
easier to access. People won't miss work as much, at
Mhm.
least for the American and Canadian crowd. So we're trying to evolve and cater as much as we can as time goes on. But it definitely did change. I mean, I remember like at Poliquin group, man, like it was crazy sometimes because the education was always batched,
Yeah.
like in period of times. So for example, like we would be like 24 days in a row teaching. And I always remember, and every course had the practical component where so we would train twice a day.
Yep.
And there was these two guys, they were from Denmark, and they came for the entire 23, 24 days of education.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
they did all days, 2 a days for that time frame. By the end, like their forearms, like they felt their like bones were breaking in half, and it was just because there was a lot of strength protocols and like heavy eccentrics and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just it's fun to reminisce sometimes. It was just a good time back then.
Yeah.
It
Like,
still is, but it's just different.
yeah. Like, I think it was, I think I did PICP level one. Oh, when I started personal training in like 2012 or 13 or something like that. And then maybe a couple of years later, it was a 5 day training camp with Milo Sarchev when he came to Australia. And like, I mean, obviously that stuff was, in the context of doing it was super fun and whatever. But like, you look at it now and it's like, oh my God, the stuff we did there was crazy. But it was just so cool to be exposed, to that environment and apply, things that you learn. You might never use them again, but I think it's really cool to kind of have those tools in your tool belt.
Yeah, yeah. And to me, it was like the camaraderie you would get with the other students coming in. It was just fun, and just like because obviously the training didn't make any sense, right? Like you would never do a bazillion different training modalities within the same training week twice a day. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense, but it was still just like a fun experience. Allows you to try or practice different methods that you would never use. So I think as a coach, it's just important to have a wide range of tools that not only you know of, but that you have tried, so that at least you know what it feels like, you know.
That you know what, that's such an important point, and I think that even comes back to maybe more in my world that the bodybuilding physique prep space is you have to kind of be able to talk the talk and walk the walk. And I think that's the main downfall I see of a lot of, this generation. I say that, being 33 years old, making myself sound old here. But like, it's easy enough to kind of just regurgitate information or learn a bunch of stuff and do courses and things like that without having applied it to yourself or your clients. And I mean, in the sense of, have you competed in a bodybuilding show? Have you done multiple shows? Have you prepped people for shows? And I think that really separates a lot of good coaches from like really great coaches who have the in the trenches knowledge, but also like the actual experience and the knowledge to back it up.
I mean, that's a great point because I think that to be a great coach, I think that you had to live experiences yourself
Hmm.
so that you know what it is.
Yeah.
You felt what it was like to go through. So you've had to have, I'm not saying you needed to be the greatest bodybuilder to be a good physique coach, but you have to go through it to understand the process. But then you have to have trained a decent amount of people
Mhm.
to know that your system or protocol of your way of doing things is actually repeatable with more than just yourself.
Yeah.
So, and then how can you communicate this with your clients so that they they can't get the success that they deserve based on the training that they're doing following your steps. And that to me, sometimes that's one of the problems with like learning from social media is you have people that take research information that sometimes always out of context, apply it to the wrong situation, and talk about this thing like it's gospel and like it works and that's the truth, but they don't really know. They've applied only to themselves for a short period of time because they learned about the information 3 months ago, and they talked about it as if it's a truth, without having the actual repetitive experience of applying that concept over and over and over and over again to know that it's actually true. Because that's the problem. Sometimes there's stuff that's been working for a while, that's been proven by research, that sometimes now gets disproven by research. So hence it's not true anymore because the science says it's not true, although the results from it in the past were, the outcomes actually happened. So maybe the explanation through science of that is not accurate, but it didn't change that the outcome from that training modality was actually true and worked. And now it's this kind of weird vibe that I feel nowadays where if you do something that doesn't coincide 100% with the latest research, even if it works, it's not true, hence it's shit. And if it's shit because it's not true, then you don't know what you're talking about, although you've done it for 35 years with success. So it gets annoying sometimes.
This is so funny because I think using you as the example, and obviously, having learned from you over the years, your meticulous nature in the way you apply, the knowledge that you have. But I feel a lot of it was almost ahead of its time. So going back to even your course and going back to Poliquin group and things like that, where they were doing things and you guys were doing things that almost seemed ahead of its time. And we come back to it now, 10 years later, and people are kind of saying, oh, this is a really cool, training method. It's like, yeah, but I learned that from Steph like 10 years ago. And I know they were doing that 10 years prior to that with Poliquin group. So it's funny how things come full circle and then it's like magical and cool and special again because science proves it. Not that like thousands of people have done it with results.
I know it's super interesting, and don't get me wrong, like I love science. Like I'm a man, like I read at least 8 to 10 hours of research a week. I really love it, but I as much as I love it, I like to put it in context, and there's a certain relative impact of research sometimes that you take what you need to apply, but sometimes you have to understand that there's limitation. Like what was the actual protocol in the study? Is it even relevant to what we're doing? Is it relevant to the people that you're actually training? So you take it to guide your steps. But one of the reasons, because sometimes people like they tell me that I'm obsessed with the old timers in terms of research. Like I love old Russian and German exercise scientists. Because what I like about that era is it was this perfect combination of practical knowledge and scientific knowledge married together on a consistent basis over time. Right? Because the coaches came from universities. So they were like crossbreeds between exercise scientists, but they were also coaches at the same time. So the protocol that they looked at certain protocol through pure scientific studies, through the eye of physiology and biomechanics and on and on and on. But what was interesting is, and that's the coach's side of things, they use that training outcome through the coach's eyes, through the application of a protocol, and they looked at what were the results over a certain period of time with these high-level athletes, and this was the outcome. Okay, great. So it was not just a 8-week study with university students on a leg extension for 3 sets of 10, 3 times a week, and then you have a certain response on a specific target they were looking at, and then boom, okay, this is the new truth. No, they were like, hey, we know that the human cell works this way. So then we can hypothesize a training modality. Let's try it with these elite athletes to create the greatest Olympic athletes ever, because they wanted to prove they were the best political system by beating everybody in the Olympics, which is just a funny thing to think about, but that was the reality.
Yeah.
So then they would train these athletes, and then they would analyze and assess the data. They were like, okay, well, they gained that much strength. They put on that much size.
Yeah.
Their fatigue level was this, was that. Oh, their testosterone dropped, their cortisol went up. And they look at all of these things. And me, with my background, being highly influenced by Charles Poliquin, well, Charles actually, one of the things he did in the 80s is he recognized that North American exercise science was limited, and that because Charles Poliquin's biggest influence was Dietmar Schmidt-Bleicher from Germany.
Yeah.
But at the time, nothing was translated. So he actually learned German, went to Germany, and started getting mentored under Schmidt-Bleicher and Rolfeister and all these guys in Germany. So then he came back to North America, took a lot of the things he learned, but it was all novel information here.
Yeah.
And then when he started writing for Muscle Media 2000, which was more of a bodybuilding magazine, which was interesting, is now he took all of that sport science information and kind of like adapted it, if you want, to more of a bodybuilding outcome. And then it became this like, wow, that's that novel thing, right? But it was all based off of sport science that he got from the Germans. So, but I guess my point here, my thought process as a coach, because of my early influence with Charles in my early 20s, because now I've been a coach for 25 years, so it's been a while. But in my early stages, I remember I paid, when I wasn't making any money at all. It was in 2002 in Chicago, the first ever BioSig course is given, and I booked a 2-hour call with him, which was like, man, think about it. Like, think about this. It was 2002 or three, and he was charging $500 an hour, something like that, US. And I had my Canadian money, and I wasn't making shit money wise. So, anyways, I booked the 2 hours. But one thing that he told me that always stuck to me, he says to me, if you want to be a great coach, make sure that you write a good program, you train your client properly, but then your job is not done. Your job starts after. Then you need to look at the data provided by your client, analyze that data, create trends from that data, see what works, see what doesn't work, and do this on your own. So I took this at heart, and I studied and analyzed everything that I did with my clients from then on. So when I was the head guy in St. Louis, and I was training mostly pro athletes, I had periods of times where I didn't really have clients because it was the off seasons, for example.
Yeah.
So I would spend the entire week gathering data, information, and looking at trends. And that's when I realized stuff like the 90-degree principle, for example, that I taught in the program design course. That was just me realizing this trend when I was looking at the data from all of my clients and athletes, and realized, holy crap, every time that there's a significant increase in strength at the end of a 12-week macro cycle in one of these lifts, the layout structure of my exercises at that 90-degree situation, right? So then you're like, oh, holy shit. So there's something there, right? But I would have never figured it out if I would not have reassessed and looked back at what I've done with my clients in the past. So that's why, to me, science, as a coach, you use science to help you make better decisions. But at the end of the day, you need to look at your protocols and analyze what you're doing and lay out the information in a way that now you can get your clients to have the greatest results possible, irrespective of what's out there.
Yeah.
Okay. Because at the end of the day, clients are paying you for what? To get results.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. So to me, it's like this. I'm highly influenced by those old time Russian and German coaches simply because they were masters at marrying practical coaching with scientific information,
Yeah,
and
and this probably
they weren't just one.
yeah, and this probably leads me into like probably one of the first points that I wanted to touch on as well. And I know you've got your new course coming out, so you don't need to give too much away. But I think in terms of what I wanted to unpack a little bit further was in your coaching practices, obviously, spending countless hours, years understanding this stuff. Like, what are the main periodizational strategies that you have found useful? And I guess if we sort of look back at, like you said, those influences to those those coaches back in the early days, a lot of what they brought forward was kind of ahead of its time. And I think even now, looking at different periodization strategies, it's kind of been poo-pooed a little bit by the more recent fitness community that like periodization doesn't really matter, and it's this weird time
Well,
of
it's only been poo-pooed by the hypertrophy community.
my point.
Yeah, because the strength or sports performance community, there's never been a debate about the efficiency of periodization.
For sure.
Uh, so I mean, we could talk about my take on hypertrophy, but outside of the hypertrophy world, I think periodization is extremely important because in the world of strength training, when you're dealing with, for example, the athletic population, there's more than hypertrophy is just one aspect of the entire picture of performance.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to peak strength, and more importantly, you need to be able to improve power, and even more specifically, rate of force development.
Yeah.
And in order to develop this, you need periodization. Without periodization, it's impossible to reach a peak in power performance uh, without any regards to some form of periodization model. Because, for example, in order to peak rate of force development, you first need to have a certain level of maximal strength.
Yep.
So you need to develop maximal strength initially. And then once you have a certain level of maximal strength, you can move on to speed strength modalities and increase rate of force development. So right there, this is periodization. Because what is periodization? Periodization is the timing of training methods in order to improve performance and mitigate fatigue.
Yep.
So as soon as you have different time periods, this is periodization. So let's say you're talking about hypertrophy, and I know now it's in this sphere, it's all about mechanical tension and blah blah. But let's say that one of your objective is to initially build some form of work capacity.
Yep.
So you want your bodybuilder to have more work capacity so that they can withstand more work, so that they have more potential of creating a positive anabolic environment through training because their recovery ability is greater. So then they can train at either a higher frequency of training
Yep.
to have more anabolic responses, or do more volume load, which, I mean, just in 2022, I saw this Brazilian study talking about how important volume load actually is on the development of hypertrophy. So if you want to be able to progressively increase volume load, you need to have some form of work capacity. So then it could be really interesting to have a phase where initially you're focusing on work capacity, and then you can then focus more on pure, true training to failure type of work. So if you're doing this right there, it's periodization.
Yeah.
And you did something initially that leverage what you're doing after with your hypertrophy work. But because one thing for sure, and this is general strength training knowledge, doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, stall.
Oh yeah.
Eventually, you stop progressing. And this is just how the human body works. It's the same thing with, like we've all, as personal trainers, I'm sure even yourself, you've dealt with guys like, hey, so what do you do? Are you active? Yes, I'm active. I run the block 3 times a week. It's 5 miles. I do this 3 times a week. Okay, how long have you been doing this for the last 5 years? Well,
Nothing's
that
changed.
person is so it's so adapted to that modality. Nothing's happening, right? So you need changes. So you need changes in repetitions and loads and intensity and range of motion and movement patterns. You don't want to always do the same exercise. You're going to create pattern overload syndrome. You're going to start having aches and pains in the joints and on and on and on. So there's so many movable pieces to training that, to me, it's impossible to completely move away from periodization. If you were to tell me, Steph, I figured out the perfect way to build muscle mass for any human being for the rest of your life, and you're saying you do 1 to 2 sets to failure of 8 reps for each body part 3 times a week, and we're doing this for life. I don't know, man. I don't know.
Doesn't sound that fun.
Maybe study. Yeah, first of all, it would be brutally boring. And maybe studies have shown it works for 8 weeks or 12 weeks, but I don't know. Try it for 5 years straight. Maybe that's why Mike Menzer's model never really ended up being that popular.
Yeah.
Because it's not really sustainable over and over and over and over again. So, and then not only that, but then you have the risk of injury, of strain all the time. The stronger you get, the more strain you have. So it's, to me, you need to be able to understand that sometimes you need to push yourself, sometimes you need to back off. When you're backing off, you need to use different approaches to create a progressive overload, because we know that progressive overload is not just one thing. It's not, people think that progressive overload is just adding more weight to the bar, but there's so much more to it, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, to me, that's the thing. I love strength training in general, and people love to pigeonhole strength training responses. But at the end of the day, you know what? Like a properly designed strength training program, you will gain hypertrophy, you will gain strength, and up to a certain point, you will gain power. Up to a certain point. Eventually, you need to be more specific. So, maybe I'm rambling here, so I don't know, but it's just like program design and periodization is my specialty. It's my passion. So for me, I could talk to you about periodization forever, but I do think for any training modalities that it's essential for long-term progress, because you need to be able to manage fatigue. Yep. And everything builds on the other. And to go back to even rate of force development, I was saying prior to rate of force development, you need to have maximal strength. But in order to maximize maximal strength, guess what you need? You need muscle hypertrophy. So on a long-term periodized plan, you would need to start building more hypertrophy so that your muscle has actually more potential for force production. Now, you increase force production through increase intramuscular coordination, which is only really done at super high loads, by the way. Yep. So you can't be doing 10 reps for life and thinking you're going to improve intramuscular coordination to a great extent. It won't happen. It's going to happen in the early stages, because the novice improves everything all at once. And that's really interesting, man. Like the Germans, like Hartmann and Thunemann, in their like great book, awesome book. I always forget the name. It's one of those like old timer sounding title, like Development of Physical Fitness or something like that. It was written in the 80s, but what's super interesting is they're showing that the novice trainee can only recruit a maximum of 60% of their total motor units. Yep. And this is the maximum. So that means that a lot of people recruit only 50, some 40% of their motor units. So that's why sometimes you're going to train people, like let's say you're doing more of a metabolic type workout, okay? Like for example, the German body comp. Yep. And you train certain people, like beginners, and they're going through the workout. It looks like they're going all out, right? They're doing 10 reps and it looks like there's no way they was going to do 11. Yeah. But they're not out of breath. They're not sweating. Well, that's only because they're recruiting so few motor units that the total output is nothing. Then you would go and try that exact same workout. You'd be puking on the B series.
I think I did the last time I did it.
Probably, but because you're using so much more motor units.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, the elite of the elite, and in the world of strength training, and the world of athletics, the biggest beasts in the weight room are typically throwers and like bobsledder for winter sports.
Yeah.
Like throwers, some have been recorded to be able to recruit like 93% of their motor units.
Wow.
Okay. So that's drastic. So these guys have incredible strength potential because they basically can use all of their potential. But these guys will also need way more recovery time. You'll
Sure.
need to be way more clever on how you're dealing with your periodization to mitigate and manage fatigue.
Yep.
So it's all in a scale.
Yeah, and that's probably an interesting point to bring up just about the newbie lifter as well. And I think that probably ties into those periodization strategies where someone doesn't necessarily have the coordination to be able to, recruit higher threshold motor units in those exercises. So they end up just doing tons and tons of volume without it really being effective. Where I think having a base level of strength is really important, even if your goal is hypertrophy, right? You have to kind of build the foundation of that house to be able to progress and have, like you said, greater muscle building potential as well.
Well, yeah, exactly, because you can only hypertrophy the fibers that you can recruit.
Mm-hmm.
So if you train yourself, if you train your nervous system to be more efficient at recruiting more motor units, well, then when you're doing your hypertrophy dedicated type of training, you will by default have more hypertrophy potential.
Yep.
Especially if you have the what's the name, the alpha actinin 3 gene. Have you ever heard of that?
Explain.
The alpha actinin 3 gene. So it's called the sprinter gene. So that's like genetically, some people have that gene,
Yep.
and some people have the alpha actinin gene, double X. Well, if you have that gene, then you have reduced ability or potential for resistance training. But if you do have uh, the alpha actinin 3 reductase gene, then your potential for strength, speed, power, and hypertrophy is
Yeah.
like it's double, triple, right? So if you have that on top of it, and you're training your nervous system to be really, really efficient at recruiting more motor units, then you're on your way for success in the sport of bodybuilding, right? So it's but if you're not training the nervous system to be more efficient, you're missing out on so much potential. And this can only really be done. So there's two ways. So like you're talking about the novice. So the novice, you need to firstly train intermuscular coordination.
Yep.
So intermuscular coordination is the ability of the nervous system to coordinate a bunch of different muscles together in the execution of movement pattern.
Yep.
So if, for example, you train your newbie with only machines,
Yep.
then the movement is so fixed that the intermuscular coordination component won't be as big. Okay. So the learning curve, like the potential of that client will never be as great.
Yep.
So that client is better off learning intermuscular coordination with complex multi-joint movements. But a big mistake a lot of trainers do is they vary too much too often these big complex multi-joint movements. So now the client, the novice client, has no ability to learn the skill because you're changing the skill all the time.
Sure.
And I use that analogy all the time. If you want to be great at shooting a basketball, you're going to, practice your technique, the same technique over and over again. You're not going to shoot like Reggie Miller one time, Bill Cartwright another time. Like you're trying to replicate the same motion to learn that skill. So it's the same thing with training. Stick to a few movements, repeat them over and over and over again so you can get good at it, so you can develop intermuscular coordination. Once you have that skill, now you can add other more complex movement so that you can further enhance your client's skill at intermuscular coordination. But intermuscular coordination is truly increased at lighter loads.
Yeah.
So Like, so that's why the newbie starting at 60% of 1 RM is actually a good thing, because it allows better intermuscular coordination. Now, as you get much more advanced in training, so somebody like you or somebody like me, for example, our intermuscular coordination, we're kind of good, right? I could not squat for a month
And you're
and then
still
go
not.
back on a squat. It would be okay. I might need a session or two to feel great, but I'd be fine.
Yep.
But do this with a full-blown newbie, like you're going to need to relearn the movement again. But what we need is improving more intramuscular coordination. Intramuscular coordination is the ability of the brain to recruit more and more and more motor units within a specific muscle group. So
Yep.
the more motor units you can activate, the more muscle fibers you can recruit. The more muscle fibers you can recruit, the more myofibrils are actually active for the contraction. But true intramuscular coordination, the minimum intensity threshold to truly train that is 90% of 1 RM.
Sure.
So even if your goal is the ultimate hypertrophy, and you've never spent any time training at 85, 90% plus, well, maybe you're missing out on a bit of potential because you did not maximize your ability to recruit as many motor units as possible through the process of intramuscular coordination. So doing a few phases of actual traditional strength training
Yep.
might be a good leverage for further gains, you know? So there are so many aspects to training that are important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one because I think that was something that I know you're really big on. Obviously, being in that strength training realm and how the transfer across to every sort of realm of training is really apparent. So, looking at that in the context of periodization, if we kind of look at how we set that up, I know you're a big fan of the kind of undulating periodization strategy of daily, weekly, or that sort
Yes.
of even something again like a lot of new trainers probably don't even understand the terms like accumulation intensification style of programming. So for someone who has no idea, what does that generally look like for you in terms of setting up that program?
So undulating periodization, basically, it's based on the concept that, because one of the problem with the traditional model from Matveyev, for example, is that like it's basically linear blocks, right? Where the intensity keeps increasing
Yep.
through time. But the problem is there's a detraining effect of previously trained qualities if you don't touch them after a while.
Yep.
So if you've done like hypertrophy or absolute strength work in the early stages, and now it's been weeks and weeks and weeks, and now you're focusing on power output, well, you're limiting your power output because you're starting to detrain and decrease the adaptations that you've had on a hypertrophy perspective.
Yep.
So the undulating model, which was, I mean, it was, to my understanding, it comes from Schmidt-Bleicher, but it was truly popularized by Charles Poliquin. And Charles Poliquin in 1988 was the first one to actually write about it in a scientific literature.
Mhm.
Okay, but but the premise of this is, well, to avoid extreme detraining, let's do a phase where we're focusing on the metabolic or the volume aspect of training.
Yep.
And then right before we're kind of plateauing that adaptation, let's swing the pendulum to now more intensive load oriented work
Yep.
to stimulate the central nervous system. And then right before we plateau these adaptations and start detraining the volume component of training, well, let's get back to this.
Yep.
So basically, you're going back and forth in a pendulum fashion, but all the while you're still moving forward linearly in terms of intensity.
Yep.
So as time increases through your macro cycle, the average intensity of work still increases, but it's just that the focus switch from one side to the other as you're doing it. So you almost need to look at it as one step back to go two steps forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the beauty of it. And one thing that we do know as well is in terms of improve or increase adaptation, you're always better off quitting on a training modality before you reach a plateau.
Yeah.
So that's also why I like 3-week mesocycles, because after 3 weeks, uh, like strength per se, it's like 28 days that you start detraining, but metabolic, like especially anaerobic enzymes and stuff like that for like lactate buffering capacity and stuff, it's more like I think it's 18 or 21 days or something like that it starts detraining. So I like the 3-week mesos because it allows me to force feed an adaptation,
Yeah.
but move away from it before I plateau. But at the same time, it allows me to get back to the previously trained quality before I start detraining it. So I'm moving away just long enough to basically create a super compensation.
Yeah.
But super compensation can only occur if something was trained through a concentrated loading before.
Sure.
So that's the beauty of undulating periodization. We're putting all of our attention on the volume / metabolic aspect of training, none on neural. Then we're moving away from this. Now we're concentrating everything on neural aspects. So that's why you're able to have that type of super compensation component. So that's why like I think it's great. And you always start with accumulation first because hypertrophy adaptations feeds or promote strength response. But the reverse won't it just wouldn't work as well to do strength prior to hypertrophy. And in the context of reaching a high peak of performance by the end of a macro. So that's why it's never intensification, accumulation. It's always accumulation, intensification.
So is that all the, like, is that always the case for, like, if your goal is maximal strength and your goal is, maximum hypertrophy, obviously, different things. Would you always run it that way? Would it always go with accumulation intensification, or is there a certain circumstance where you might start at the opposite and go intensification first?
Never. If you want to optimize results, you should never do it because fatigue masks fitness, and it doesn't matter what modality it is.
Yeah.
Even hypertrophy. There's actually been a few research, but even outside of research, you know it yourself as bodybuilders, because I've been in the bodybuilding scene myself. My first mentor was is a IFBB pro, and how often have you seen it with bodybuilders? They train their asses off, they diet their asses off, then they go to the competition, and then they're like, "Oh shit, kind of flat, and they don't look as good as I thought."
Yeah.
And then competition is done, they start chilling, they start relaxing a little bit, and like 4 or 5 days later, they look perfect. They look great. They filled up. I'm not saying they put on size in terms of, oh yeah, they synthesize like 7 pounds of new muscle. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But 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 because of the relaxation, there's a overcompensation effect in terms of decrease in stress hormone, so increase in nutrient storing capacity. So there's higher glycogen storage. There's more vascularity because there's more oxygen feeding the capillaries, and on and on. So now your physique is actually bigger, harder, fuller, and on a performance perspective, you just look better.
Yeah.
And if you were to take a body fat, it looks like you have more muscle simply because your lean body mass. I'm not saying you have more raw muscle, but your lean body mass is higher.
Sure.
So that's the thing. Even if you want to peak hypertrophy, you're still better off accumulation intensification because fatigue masks fitness. So by the time you're finishing your intensification phase, because the overall volume is less and the intensity is higher,
yeah,
any type of overwork that you've created through volume will dissipate, so you can manifest a greater outcome of hypertrophy or strength or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. That's the nature of the model. That's how Zatsiorsky explains it with the fitness paradigm.
Yep.
That's just how it is. To do the opposite would be completely counter to human physiology.
Yeah. And like, I love the approach. So I think for For people who don't really understand it, just to give some context, the main goal there is over the course of multiple training cycles, you're increasing that intensity towards the end of, let's say, a year. Like across a year, you're going to have, those 3-week mesocycles, and you're going to have increases in intensity throughout those training cycles across that entire year, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Like it's going to undulate
Yeah.
across the year. So that like if you were to look at a big picture of the entire year, phase one would be your lowest intensity.
Yeah.
And the last phase, like phase 16, basically, would be your highest intensity.
Yeah.
And then you have everything in between that just undulates. And it undulates simply to manage fatigue, mitigate boredom, and monotonous training variables, so that you at least delay or reduce the likelihood of plateaus or strain or injury. So it's to me it's a cool thing, and there's so many ways to do it depending on your goals, like you were talking about. Like phase undulating is the one I use the most because it creates more saturation, and the novice and intermediate, which is the majority of people that we're ever going to train,
Yeah.
needs more saturation of a system in order to force feed an adaptation. But the more advanced you become, or the shorter the time frame you have to reach a goal, the cuter you can be if you want with your models by using weekly undulating or even more variation, daily undulating, because now you're submitting yourself to a wider range of stimulus, but you need to have the neural development and efficiency to be able to cope with that many changes in a short time frame. So that's why, like, I would never tell a novice to do daily undulating periodization. It would be horrible. It wouldn't work very well. And even to the point where certain novice, you're better off just doing linear, because linear, it allows you a more gradual, progressive overload strategy to better fuel the development of intermuscular coordination. Because the novice, the problem sometimes with undulating periodization is you need to be able to know your loads enough to be able to jump from one end of the continuum to the other end efficiently. Because when you don't know and you're going from accumulation to intensification, it might take you 3 weeks to just figure out what weight you should have been using for your sets of 5. But when you're going linear, it's so much more progressive that you're actually getting to your RM on a sustainable fashion. And once you've done a few cycles of linear periodization, if you paid attention to your loads, now you should know, okay, on this lift, my 5 RM is bam. My 6 RM is bam. But to make undulating very effective, you need to get to that point. But when I'm training someone one-on-one, I can jump to undulating real quick because I'm controlling that aspect. But when you're a regular folk who start to train, you don't know, and you're training on your own. So you're much better off taking your time with a linear approach. And then you have wave periodization. Like I was telling you before the podcast, like it's one of these things where it's not really in the literature. There's no studies on it, but it was mentioned by some, like Mike Stone, for example, even Bill Kramer talked about wave periodization. But it's something I've done for myself and my clients for a long time, and it's really cool. But it's more for the advanced intermediate to advanced training, and now it's kind of like this slow burn approach to reach a goal where you're waving the load through a macro cycle. So, for example, you could go from like this would be a single wave macro cycle, but you could go like week 1. You're doing 8 reps. Week 2, you're doing 6 reps. Week 3, you're doing 4 reps. And then week 5, week 4, you're going back to 8 reps. Then to 6 reps. Then to 4 reps. So it's kind of a blend between linear and undulating, basically, right? So you're linearly going from that 8 to 6 to 4. But then before you're completely detraining that 8, let's revisit it. Let's do another 8, another 6, another 4. So that's a good approach when you really want to truly target a very specific training response because the window in intensities is narrower, right? Because if we go from 8 to 4, we're talking about a 10% window of intensity.
Yep.
So you can this one would specifically target absolute strength.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so if you want to force feed absolute strength, let's say your alignment in football, and you have a long off season, and during our GPP we want to increase absolute strength, this would be a great approach because our entire GPP is in the absolute strength intensity realm.
Yeah.
But if you're doing linear or undulating, then the range of intensity is a little wider. We're getting closer to the 18-ish, maybe 20% window. So now we're subjecting the trainee to a wider pool of training outcomes.
Yeah. Then in terms of, I guess, the next question I wanted to ask you then, volume being like a sort of a highly debated topic, especially in the hypertrophy world. When we're looking at these types of things, and I suppose when you're looking at program design, how is volume, I guess, looked at and how is it accounted for in a training cycle, either, hard weekly sets, or is it, working sets per workout? Like, how are you generally looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care about hard weekly sets in the context of strength because that's not how I look at training with strength. So it's a little different. And what's important to understand is true in strength training, true volume is calculated through volume load.
Yep.
So the number of sets is a very poor representation of volume. To just know sets, it doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
So you need to know the number of sets, the number of reps, and the load you're using.
Yeah.
And when you know these three things, then you can look at volume load. And volume load is the expression of volume that you truly need to look at to manage fatigue.
Yeah.
Because that's what's really important. And volume load is like I was telling you about the 2022 Brazilian study on hypertrophy. Well, they were showing a positive response. Basically, it was a dose response to the expression of volume load.
Yep.
So the more volume load you add, the greater the hypertrophy outcome.
Yep.
But again, volume load had nothing to do with just the number of sets. It
Yep.
was the combination of the three parameters. So the way I look at it is depending on hypertrophy, absolute strength, relative strength, or power, what I've noticed is you have like intensity volume windows and volume load windows that are appropriate, that will work with the majority of people to really drive the adaptation you want for that skill. So I use these windows. And then when I build my training programs, I make sure that each phase falls within that window of volume.
Yeah.
And then depending on the client, because once you do 1 12-week macro with a client, you should know exactly if you have a low volume guy, a medium volume guy, or a high volume guy.
Yeah.
Your medium volume guy will straight up be your 75 to 80% of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a decent amount of people that will fall in the low volume, especially nowadays with all the stress that we're encountering in day-to-day life. And then you have like the few I'm talking less than 5% that are going to be in the high volume. Like I have a few clients like this, or just, they typically also come from an endurance sport background. They just can't, they just do really, really well with volume. So then you qualify them. Are you low, medium, or high?
Yep.
And then based off of that, I follow these volume guidelines for each goal that I'm training. And then I just keep going and I just keep going. And then I monitor, right? So you have like external, like training load factors can be addressed through internal and external factors. So the external factors are like the load you're using. Are you progressing in weight? Are you improving your load 2% every workout? So those are very straightforward. But the internal factors are like the stress encountered by the client, their motivation, their drive. So, but this, I use questionnaires, it's just basic kind of questionnaires where you're ranking how you feel on a scale,
Yeah. Like
right?
a
So then I
readiness
look
score.
at this, yeah, like a readiness score. So
Yeah.
if I'm training my client and I'm seeing that for the last 4 weeks his readiness score is shit all of a sudden, well, you know what? Let's readjust the volume downwards now
Yeah.
because you're not going to recover from it. So volume is something that I manipulate a lot. Like intensity gauges the periodization, and volume perfects the periodization.
Yeah.
But it comes from the intensity first. Uh, and I don't know, I'm losing myself with this, but I guess my point is I believe volume is important. Volume load is the true factor you look at. It needs to be manipulated. It needs to be appropriate to the goal, but it needs to be managed, and it needs to cater to the ability of recovery of the client. At the end of the day, that's all. That's what it's all about. But I do like what I do know, and we know this for sports training. Uh, the more you're able to get someone to recover and do well with high volume, the higher the ceiling of performance you can reach.
Yeah.
The strongest, most powerful people in the world are also typically the people who are able to endure the highest amount of volume of work.
Yeah.
So that's why, to me, it's important because my problem is even if I'm training people for hypertrophy, I always have my strength coach sports performance bias. So I want that person to be a beast, to be a machine, to be able to do work and recover and do work and recover and do work and recover and thrive on it. One, it allows you to eat more.
Yeah.
So you can store more glycogen, you can store more nutrients so that you can recover better, so that you can have a faster protein turnover rate, so you can actually affect change faster. So to me, it's like it's something that I want. I'm training someone. I want you to build work capacity.
Yeah.
I want you to be able to endure more work so we can reach a higher ceiling, a higher potential. It takes time. It takes monitoring. It's not for everyone. So that's why you really need to be careful and pay attention to who you're dealing with.
And I guess in terms of what you mean by increased work capacity, you're talking about just their ability to kind of handle more volume and more volume load over the course of, many weeks and months.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, there are like there are training modalities that can kind of initiate or facilitate your ability to tolerate more volume of work at high loads over time.
Yep.
Like old school bodybuilding technique that are more like metabolically dominant, like supersets and trisets and stuff like that.
Yep.
Simply because these, what it will do is it will improve your ability to buffer lactate, hydrogen ions, or inorganic phosphagen. So it's going to improve that. It's going to improve your ability to store nutrient. It's going to increase the amount of capillaries. So it's going to improve your ability uh, to bring oxygen to the muscle so it can recover better and can recover faster.
Yep.
So that's why I like, if you ever look at one of my hypertrophy programs, I like to start the first phase with the highest time under tension training modality first. When you're weaker, simply to from the get-go drive more work capacity
Yep.
and then kick it out, so then we can focus on more metabolic tension type of work later on, but that you're more effective at reproducing high levels of tension over and over and over and over again. But in my opinion, you do far better when you precede this by a phase where you're building that work capacity through increased nutrient storage and oxygen consumption and on and on and on, simply because you become a better recovery machine.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
I think that definitely leads me into my next question. This was something that I really wanted to touch on with you around those training well, I guess we'd call them like advanced training strategies. So things like supersets and drop sets and trisets and all the fun stuff that happen in some of your workouts that we did back in Huntington. Where do they fit in your uh, programming scenario? And do you feel that they have a place in most people's programs?
I mean, they have a place in intermediate to advanced people's programs. They can fit anywhere, but they tend to fit better. They tend to fit better with hypertrophy or absolute strength.
Yep.
And because the problem is I have different styles of training depending on the goal. But the majority of the time, what happens is we separate our training sessions in three parts for the most part. We have our primary exercise, which is the A series. So the primary exercise is your multi-joint compound movement. Then we have the B series. So it's assistance work that drives the performance of the multi-joint primary movement.
Sure.
And then we have the C series, which is remedial work that helps target specific muscles that can be limiting factors or that are limiting factors that by isolating, improving injury prevention or performance potential. And each and every one of these sections is loaded differently because they have different goals. So for example, the A series, because I'm focusing more on multi-joint compound movement that are skill-based, where intermuscular coordination is so important, here I don't train to failure on all sets. I'll use step loading. So let's say we're doing 5 sets, 5 by 6. I'll use step loading. So at first, you're doing your first set with 10% or 10 to 12% less of your 6RM. Why? Because we're doing this to rehearse the skill, to develop more and more intermuscular coordination. It's really hard to improve intermuscular coordination when you're training to failure all the time. Plus, the problem is if I were to train to failure right off the bat on that back squat or front squat, I won't be able to do 5 sets. I might only be able to do 1, 2, 3 sets if I'm a freaking beast. Okay? So now the problem is I didn't build intermuscular coordination because I didn't have enough rehearsal. I did not have enough high intensity reps to develop the skill of intermuscular coordination. So I'm not getting better at intermuscular coordination. So that's why you need to use step loading so that you can rehearse. But now, as we're step loading, I get to my 5th set. Now my 5th set will be a 6RM, technical failure 6RM. And or, depending on your ability to tolerate workload, a 1 or maybe 2 reps in reserve.
Sure.
And the thing that you need to understand is the A series, because it's multi-joint compound movements, on average, if in the context of undulating periodization, on average, in a lifetime, your rep will be 6. 6 is 83% of 1RM. 83% of 1RM falls in the maximal strength window, which means that intensity is high enough in terms of tensile properties to create maximal tension, simply because it's so much load that by default, you're going to prioritize the recruitment of fast twitch fibers to do your set. And these fast twitch fibers have very poor work capacity. And in order to fully train a fiber, it needs to be exhausted. So you need to train it. So the fast twitch fiber, you're going to recruit it, but it's going to be trained right away because it's going to fatigue right away. So you don't necessarily need to train to full-blown failure in each and every set when you're dealing with loads over 80% of 1RM, because the nature of the load is high enough to create enough tension to elicit a training response.
Sure.
So that's why the A series, I'm not as worried about training to failure, but I'm still going to do that last set or close to it. Now, the B series, we're doing assistance work. The complexity of the exercise are not as big. and I'm using this to springboard my primary movement. So I might only do 2 or 3 sets of B series. And now the thing is, because their assistance work, the intensity is less. Now we're talking about intensities between like the 6 to 12 reps.
Yeah.
So that kind of like 70 to 80% window. But now the load is not high enough to by default elicit maximal tension. So now you need to train to failure if you want these sets to be effective on a strength training response component.
Yeah.
So my B series, I'll take to failure. Okay. And then the C, but like I said, it's 2 or 3 sets.
Yeah.
Then the C series, now we're talking about single joint isolated movements. It can be bis, tris, but we're talking about one exercise, single joint.
Yeah.
If it's bis and tris, I'll take those to failure. It doesn't matter. But if I'm doing, let's say, rotator cuff or scap retraction work because the client has funky shoulders, then I might use a submaximal effort, meaning that I have a few reps short of failure, simply because I want to groove the pattern and I want to make sure that the client has the proper range of motion. If I'm going to failure here and the movement pattern is all messed up, I'm not really targeting what I want to target to improve the shoulder health, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying, like, my training sessions are multifaceted in that sense, which now it makes it very hard to get back to the whole volume perspective. It makes it very hard for me to now talk about total sets being performed and effective sets, this and that, because I cannot count my A series work into it, because my A series is mostly intermuscular coordination work on the skill movement. And I cannot just talk about my B series because I still did the A series, which was still work. So you know what I mean? So that's why I have more of these general volume and volume load windows that I try to make sure that I fall in.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I really love about the way you program. It's very meticulous. It's very well thought out in terms of, like, logically this makes sense how you set up an actual program, and I guess the rest of the other stuff is less important when you've got all those variables laid out for a particular goal.
Yeah. So then to answer the question, I'm long-winded, I know. To answer the question of the special methods. So then I would use them in the C or B series.
Yeah.
So let's say we're doing 1.25 rep or rest pause or drop sets. Well, I would first start, I would introduce them in the C series. Why? Because it's at the end of the workout. It's a single joint movement. It's more manageable. So now we're driving volume on a single joint movement. So I'm not creating this huge dip in fatigue. I'm not going to do this right off the bat on front squat.
No.
Okay? And then after, I might be like, okay, now we're going to introduce it to the B series only. Now, can you deal with it now? Okay, yes, you can. Now, maybe we're going to try B and C. So maybe we're doing, rest pause in the B series and double 1.25 if it makes sense for the movement in the C series.
Yeah.
So it's just one way to create more volume load in an efficient manner without adding so much more time to your training session.
Yeah.
But that fits the narrative of the goal of the program. So that's why I was saying that I use this mostly just for hypertrophy or absolute strength. I wouldn't use that for strength or power. And power, by the way, you should never train to failure, because you're going to completely negate your ability to improve rate of force development. So all of these things have their place and times. It really depends on the goal.
Yeah, and I think, like, the way that I view this, and even the way I set up programs as well for my clients, obviously being more geared towards hypertrophy, is utilizing those special training methods, exactly as you said, to increase volume load over the course of a training cycle. So if we're trying to accumulate volume, it's like, if we're adding, if we're just doing all straight sets, for example, and we add drop sets into, this exercise or this workout, you've now effectively increased volume for that workout. If we did that on, a subsequent manner each mesocycle, you're increasing volume load across many training cycles.
Exactly. And more efficiently, right? So you don't need to be in the gym for 2 hours.
Yeah, well, that's a massive one.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Sure. No, but that's what I was saying. Like, like it's hard to train hard for more than an hour for most people. Like on a nervous system perspective, like past that 60-minute window, man, like your ability to recruit high threshold motor units just plummets.
Yeah.
So like the training just becomes less and less effective. I mean, especially if you're talking more about strength or
Yeah.
power, but still like, and then but even for us as professionals, right? What do we sell? We sell 60-minute session. So I want to maximize my 60-minute session with the client.
Yeah.
So if I need to increase volume load, I much rather do this than to keep adding more standard set across a training program and it takes 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I like to use these things.
And going back to the fatigue thing and the time component of a session. So there's this
Yeah.
massive um sort of kickback or pushback on advanced training techniques or specialty methods about the fatigue component, that they're so fatiguing that like you should never do them, and it's just going to dig into your recoverability into the next session, that you're not going to be able to perform at your best. Is that something that you've found with utilizing specialty training methods, or is it really context specific?
No, I haven't found that to be an issue for me, but also I do not use the training splits of the people who say that that's an issue.
Yeah.
So again, because to me, like we made a post like on Instagram, Kilo, a few weeks ago, and the post was just the word context on it, simply because I think that that's what's lost right now.
Yeah.
So if you're one of those coaches that what you love to do is full body 3 times a week,
Yeah.
so you're training the same muscle groups 3 times a week in a full body session, yes, of course.
Mhm.
Of course, it's going to affect your recovery. There's no way in hell you're going to be able to redo that exact same muscle group or that exact same movement 48 hours later.
Yeah.
So, yes, in that context, it's a problem. But I use upper lower splits. So, and not only that, I use different exercises every workout. So, the motor units that I recruited on my overhead press on Monday are not the same motor units of the motor units I'm going to recruit on my bench press on Thursday.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a pressing movement. Yes, it's the upper body. Yes, there's some crossover. Yes, there's some systemic neural fatigue. But physiologically speaking, they're different motor units.
Yeah.
So it doesn't affect anything. It's fine. It's on how you're using them and how you're training your clients to recover from them and how you've built your client to get to the point where they can use this effectively. But my models allows for it. But if you were to say now, Steph, now you need 8 exercises and they repeat 3 times a week for the same muscle group. Hell, okay, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'm training to failure on top of it.
Yeah.
I'm doing 3 sets, of course.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that pushback comes from that crowd.
Yeah. Big
But
time.
that crowd for me, it's to me it's a funny crowd because it's not the crowd. I mean, with my sports performance bias, it's not something it's not even a concern for us because we don't program that way
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah.
You know?
The probably the last couple of points I wanted to bring up then. So I really do love the way that you look at designing those sessions. And I know you've got the obviously your 90-degree principle that you spoke about earlier in terms of the pressing angles and strength progression, I guess. In terms of the specific exercises you're looking at, so how you lay out a week of training, give us a bit of a rundown in terms of what movements they are and how that fits into the broader picture of your program design.
Yeah, so we have like 8 movements that we call primate, but it's 8 movement patterns that we feel that as a strength athlete you should be strong on to
Yeah.
have great overall strength development, because strength is very specific. Like one of the problems with powerlifting, for example, and I like to bring up this example in classes, One time I trained a lineman that in college and the NFL, their coaches were West Side guys. So his training was always bench, 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 bench. And when I assessed him, his bench was huge. Like he had like with a 4010 tempo, he had like a 435-pound bench.
Yeah, wow.
But, but do you, do you know what his overhead press was for that same tempo?
Probably not even close to
95.
that. Yeah, wow.
95 pounds. So
Jeez.
that's a crazy strength discrepancy, right?
Yeah.
Because strength is very specific. It's very angle specific. But if I'm training a lineman, the lineman, and he was a guard on top of it.
Mm.
So as a guard, you're not pushing at that angle all the time. In fact, you're barely ever pushing at that angle. You're
Yeah.
pushing more at that angle. Okay. So to me, it was like, well, we need to get you strong across the board. So the whole primate, it's that premise in mind. So
Yeah.
we have the back squat, the front squat, the deadlift, the overhead press, the incline press, the bench press, the dip, and the chin up, which is the only true compound multi-joint upper body movement if you want.
Yep.
There's a bent over row as well, but I prefer the chin up because the range of motion is greater.
Yeah.
So these are our primary. So I try with people to get them stronger on all of these over time, just so that they're more overall functional strength beast across all fronts. But now, of course, not everybody is able to perform these movements properly,
Mm-hmm.
which means that now we need to develop the skill to regress the movement to fit where the client is at a certain point in time. So if a client can't do a proper front squat, well, what it is that I can do with that client that's going to mimic a front squat as much as possible, but that's
Yep.
going to be feasible and healthy for that client. And then from that starting point, I'm going to progress it over time to be able to perform a proper front squat. And some people, you know what, they're never going to be able to. It's no big deal. But
Mm.
at least we're working towards developing that pattern. So we have good overall strength development.
Yeah, which is really cool. And I think from an injury standpoint, it's really, a pretty obvious strategy to kind of be strong everywhere, so you don't develop these inconsistencies in your movement patterns too, and pick up injuries.
Yeah. And it also adds variety to the training. So it's more fun for the client because they're not always doing the same thing.
Hmm.
So it's different challenges and on and on. So it keeps it interesting as you're building the strength, but of course it's not as directed, right? So when you're a
Mhm.
power lifter and you're trying to improve your bench and all you're doing is bench,
Yep.
you can typically reach top results a little faster because you're only concentrating on this.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, like the overall strength is more than just one lift.
Yeah. Yeah. Unless that's your specific goal, then do that, obviously.
Oh, no, yeah, no, of course, of course. If you're a power lifter, you need to do that.
Yeah. So probably one of the
Yeah.
last points that I wanted to bring up then, in terms of, we spoke about building work capacity, and we kind of alluded to the fact that like increasing capillary density, especially for hypertrophy potential down the line. Looking at different cardiovascular modalities. So I know this is something that you're really big on in terms of the conditioning side of things. When we're looking at the conditioning and how it's added to a program, where does that generally fit in? And what does it look like in terms of actual, I guess, modality or kind of the things that you do in terms of a program?
Yeah. So this one kind of depends. Like if you're training somebody who's really, really overweight or who's very unhealthy, I would use more like just typical aerobic capacity work, like some steady state cardio, zone 1, zone 2 type of stuff.
Yep.
And you just build volume over time on this.
Sure.
And this can go can go pretty much anywhere you want, okay? Because the recovery curve of this is not too extreme.
Yeah.
With the athletic population, I would first start in the GPP. I would focus more on aerobic capacity and aerobic power in the early stages if they don't have a base.
Yeah.
Like if let's say they've been off of training for a month or so, I'll start with that. And then as we move on to the specific preparation phase, then I'll start working on the anaerobic work. And I'll typically start with anaerobic power to anaerobic alactic power to anaerobic alactic capacity to anaerobic lactic power to anaerobic lactic capacity. So I follow that in a very standard continuum because it makes sense on a periodization standpoint, in the sense that in order to build buffering capacity at high force and high speed, I first need to build that speed.
Yep.
If I'm trying to build capacity of a lower speed and now and then I build more speed, then I don't have the capacity for that higher speed. So that's why it's just a very logical continuum. So this will go along the way in a linear fashion across the SPP. And typically I like to use a modified strongman with athletes because you're kind of deloading running, which they're doing all the time. And you're making the strength training work that's typically sagittal plane dominant in the weight room to now more functional, because now we're going to do modified strongman exercise that are also working in the transverse and frontal plane at different velocities, at different ranges of motion. So now you're getting this very cool general energy system development or conditioning development, but also at the same time making that strength, that weight room strength, a little bit more functional, in the sense that now you're using your grip and you're moving with load and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what I like. So it's not very sport specific. It's still general, but I'm improving this in the off season. So now that once they get to the preseason, now they can do their actual specific sports task with specific sports work to rest ratio, but at least they've built the engine mechanism that's going to allow them to perfect or get better with their sports work to rest ratio. And then for the average trainee, just training for strength, I like to do conditioning, modified strongman conditioning, more in the maximum aerobic power, aerobic lactate capacity type of work to rest ratio, simply to create more of a metabolic output that differs from the strength training.
Yep.
So we're not kind of like gorging the week with the same type of stimulus all the time. So it's a different outcome, different recovery modes. And I like to do it either on Wednesday and Saturday, which are on off days, with clients that have a harder time being consistent with nutrition, because I find what I've noticed with people, they tend to adhere better to a nutrition plan if they're doing something every day. Like they're less likely to go smash a burger if they have to do a conditioning session on a certain day.
Yeah.
But if I'm dealing with people who are more in control, I actually prefer doing the conditioning sessions on the PM of the lower body days, because you favor better overall recovery.
Yep.
And on the off days, you might just do active recovery, like go for a walk or something like that. But that's how I like to lay it out.
Yeah, cool. And it's I think it's one of those things that's probably underutilized by a lot of people, purely as you said, for the enhancers in recovery, but also the ability to kind of buffer lactate and to be able to just train harder as well. Because generally the fitter you are, the more you can clear metabolites, the harder you could probably train, right?
Yeah, and you know what too? It's also like, even for hypertrophy, what I've noticed is it's also a cool indirect opportunity to create another protein synthesis window. Because depending on how hard you're doing it, you will create a anabolic response. So you can actually use that opportunity for another bout of peri-workout nutrition to emphasize your hypertrophy response by adding more work, but more work done with a different modality. So you're not stressing the exact same system. You're not stressing the joints the same way. You're not stressing the nervous system the same way, but you're still creating some form of muscle protein synthesis response, just like you would with speed skaters or short track cyclists, for example, right? They're using different modalities for the same goal, if you want.
Yeah.
So it's a cool little add-on that you can use that's very easy. And at the same time, it improves your work capacity and improves your health.
So a no-brainer for most people. They should be doing cardio.
Yes. 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 I think it was demonized for a little bit, and like my mentor was one big part of it, but I think that was a huge mistake, and I
Yeah.
think that now people are realizing it, and the science is pretty strong on the positive effects of combining cardiovascular work to your strength training,
Yeah.
especially on a health perspective, like blood pressure management, and on and on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there seems to be a bunch of cool research even out at the moment looking at yeah, exactly what you mentioned, the addition of cardio training with resistance training just for general health and longevity, man. Like it's so important for, you know, most normal people just to be able to live longer and healthier.
Yeah, and you know what? Like one of the reasons why I became a huge fan of steady state aerobic these days is it's the only time that I can really listen to podcasts and stuff. So you know,
I,
it's a cool way to get those in. To be honest,
I have to applaud you and Kelsey. I've seen the videos and the photos of you guys hitting your cardio every day, so it's awesome to see.
yeah, that's cool.
Dude,
It's not
well,
the most fun thing in the world, but
yeah, no, I say the same thing when I get up at 5:30 to jump on the bike and do my steady state.
yeah,
But I think that is us, man. I really want to say thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I always love chatting and picking your brain. So to wrap this up, I know you've got the Europe trip coming up, some cool seminars, and then
yeah.
your education schedule coming up for next year. So for anyone out there that wants to find out what you guys do, what you have happening, what's the best way for people to get in contact and find more about you guys?
Yeah, so we have a website, learnkilo.com. We have Instagram, Kilo Strength Society. Then I have my personal, like Stephane.Cazeault Instagram page where it's just give random tips on training. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome, man. Well, everyone should absolutely go.
I'm sorry, I forgot. We also have the podcast.
Oh,
It's
of
pretty
course.
cool, like because we it's called the Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew, and it's the four of us. And so far, it's only the four of us, and we're basically just chit chatting, strength training topics for like an hour or so. So it's kind of cool. Like we give a lot of information. So for those of you who do education with us, it's a good way to fill in the blanks on stuff you might have misunderstood and stuff like that. So we're pretty happy with it. So that's on YouTube, Spotify, the whole shebang, Apple.
All the good stuff. Well, I implore everyone to go out and jump on all of your socials and get as much information from you guys because again, like, you know, attending your course, what, 6 years ago now, and we're still having these conversations. So it's forever valuable for anyone that wants to take their knowledge to the next level. So Steph, I thank you so much for jumping on tonight, and I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome, man. It was fun.
Pleasure, man. Take care.